5. Helping Freddie. I don't want to bore you, don't you know, and all that sort of rot, but I must tell you about dear old Freddie Meadows. I'm not a flyer at literary style and all that, but I'll get some writer chappie to give the thing a wash and a brush up when I've finished, and that'll be all right. Dear old Freddie, don't you know, has been a dear old pal of mine for years and years. So when I went into the club one morning and found him sitting alone in a dark corner, staring glassily at nothing, and generally looking like the last rose of summer, you can understand I was quite disturbed about it. As a rule, the old rotter is the life and soul of our set. Quite the little lump of fun and all that sort of thing. Jimmy Pinkerton was with me at the time. Jimmy's a fellow who writes plays, a deuced brainy sort of fellow, and between us we set to work to question the poor pop-eyed chappie until we finally got at what the matter was. As we might have guessed, it was a girl. He had had a quarrel with Angela West, the girl he was engaged to, and she had broken off the engagement. What the row had been about he didn't say, but apparently she was pretty well fed up. She wouldn't let him come near her, refused to talk on the phone, and sent back his letters unopened. I was sorry for poor old Freddie. I knew what it felt like. I was once in love myself with a girl called Elizabeth Shoolbred, and the fact that she couldn't stand me at any price will be recorded in my autobiography. I knew the thing for Freddie. "Change of scene is what you want, old scout," I said. "Come with me to Marvis Bay. I've taken a cottage there. Jimmy's coming down on the 24th. We'll be a cozy party." "He's absolutely right," said Jimmy. "Change of scene's the thing. I knew a man. Girl refused him. Man went abroad. 2 months later, girl wired him. Come back, Muriel. Man started to write out a reply. Suddenly found that he couldn't remember the girl's surname, so never answered at all." But Freddie wouldn't be comforted. He just went on looking as if he had swallowed his last sixpence. However, I got him to promise to come to Marvis Bay with me. He said he might as well be there as anywhere. Do you know Marvis Bay? It's in Dorsetshire. It isn't what you'd call a fiercely exciting spot, but it has its good points. You spend the day there bathing and sitting on the sands, and in the evening you stroll out on the shore with the gnats. At 9 o'clock you rub ointment on the wounds and go to bed. It seemed to suit poor old Freddie. Once the moon was up and the breeze sighing in the trees, you couldn't drag him from that beach with a rope. He became quite a popular pet with the gnats. They'd hang round waiting for him to come out, and would give perfectly good strollers the miss in baulk just so as to be in good condition for him. Yes, it was a peaceful sort of life, but by the end of the first week I began to wish that Jimmy Pinkerton had arranged to come down earlier, for as a companion, Freddie, poor old chap, wasn't anything to write home to Mother about. When he wasn't chewing a pipe and scowling at the carpet, he was sitting at the piano, playing The Rosary with one finger. He couldn't play anything except The Rosary, and he couldn't play much of that. Somewhere around the third bar a fuse would blow out, and he'd have to start all over again. He was playing it as usual one morning when I came in from bathing. "Reggie," he said in a hollow voice, looking up, "I've seen her." "Seen her?" I said. "What? Miss West?" "I was down at the post office, getting the letters, and we met in the doorway. She cut me." He started playing The Rosary again, and side-slipped in the second bar. "Reggie," he said, "you ought never to have brought me here. I must go away." "Go away," I said. "Don't talk such rot. This is the best thing that could have happened. This is where you come out strong." "She cut me." "Never mind. Be a sportsman. Have another dash at her." "She looked clean through me." "Of course she did. But don't mind that. Put this in my hands. I'll see you through. Now what you want," I said, "is to place her under some obligation to you. What you want is to get her timidly thanking you. What you want, but what's she going to thank me timidly for?" I thought for a moment. Look out for a chance and save her from drowning, I said. I can't swim, said Freddy. That was Freddy all over, don't you know. A dear old chap in 1,000 ways, but no help to a fellow, if you know what I mean. He cranked up the piano once more, and I sprinted for the open. I strolled out onto the sands and began to think this thing over. There was no doubt that the brainwork had to be done by me. Dear old Freddy had his strong qualities. He was top hole at polo, and in happier days I've heard him give an imitation of cats fighting in a backyard that would have surprised you. But apart from that, he wasn't a man of enterprise. Well, don't you know, I was rounding some rocks, with my brain whirring like a dynamo, when I caught sight of a blue dress, and, by Jove, it was the girl. I had never met her, but Freddy had 16 photographs of her sprinkled round his bedroom, and I knew I couldn't be mistaken. She was sitting on the sand, helping a small, fat child build a castle. On a chair close by was an elderly lady reading a novel. I heard the girl call her aunt. So, doing the Sherlock Holmes business, I deduced that the fat child was her cousin. It struck me that if Freddy had been there, he would probably have tried to work up some sentiment about the kid on the strength of it. Personally, I couldn't manage it. I don't think I ever saw a child who made me feel less sentimental. He was one of those round, bulging kids. After he had finished the castle, he seemed to get bored with life and began to whimper. The girl took him off to where a fellow was selling sweets at a stall, and I walked on. Now, fellows, if you ask them, will tell you that I'm a chump. Well, I don't mind. I admit it. I am a chump. All the Peppers have been chumps. But what I do say is that every now and then, when you least expect it, I get a pretty hot brainwave. And that's what happened now. I doubt if the idea that had come to me then would have occurred to a single one of any dozen of the brainiest chappies you care to name. It came to me on my return journey. I was walking back along the shore when I saw the fat kid meditatively smacking a jellyfish with a spade. The girl wasn't with him. In fact, there didn't seem to be anyone in sight. I was just going to pass on when I got the brainwave. I thought the whole thing out in a flash, don't you know. From what I had seen of the two, the girl was evidently fond of this kid. And anyhow, he was her cousin, so what I said to myself was this. If I kidnap this young heavyweight for the moment, and if, when the girl has got frightfully anxious about where he can have got to, dear old Freddy suddenly appears leading the infant by the hand and telling a story to the effect that he has found him wandering at large about the country and practically saved his life, why, the girl's gratitude is bound to make her chuck hostilities and be friends again. So I gathered in the kid and made off with him. All the way home I pictured that scene of reconciliation. I could see it so vividly, don't you know, that by George it gave me quite a choky feeling in my throat. Freddy, dear old chap, was rather slow at getting on to the fine points of the idea. When I appeared, carrying the kid, and dumped him down in our sitting-room, he didn't absolutely effervesce with joy, if you know what I mean. The kid had started to bellow by this time, and poor old Freddy seemed to find it rather trying. "Stop it," he said. "Do you think nobody's got any troubles except you? What the deuce is all this, Reggie?" The kid came back at him with a yell that made the window rattle. I raced to the kitchen and fetched a jar of honey. It was the right stuff. The kid stopped bellowing and began to smear his face with the stuff. "Well," said Freddy, when silence had set in. I explained the idea. After a while it began to strike him. "You are not such a fool as you look sometimes, Reggie," he said handsomely. "I'm bound to say this seems pretty good." Then he disentangled the kid from the honey jar and took him out, to scour the beach for Angela. I don't know when I've felt so happy. I was so fond of dear old Freddy that to know that he was soon going to be his old bright self again made me feel as if somebody had left me about £1,000,000. I was leaning back in a chair on the veranda, smoking peacefully, when down the road I saw the old boy returning, and, by George, the kid was still with him. And Freddy looked as if he hadn't a friend in the world. "Hello," I said. "Couldn't you find her?" "Yes, I found her," he replied, with one of those bitter, hollow laughs. "Well, then—" Freddie sank into a chair and groaned. "This isn't her cousin, you idiot," he said. "He's no relation at all. He's just a kid she happened to meet on the beach. She had never seen him before in her life." "What? Who is he, then?" "I don't know. Oh, Lord, I've had a time. Thank goodness you'll probably spend the next few years of your life at Dartmoor for kidnapping. That's my only consolation. I'll come and jeer at you through the bars." "Tell me all, old boy," I said. It took him a good long time to tell the story, for he broke off in the middle of nearly every sentence to call me names, but I gathered gradually what had happened. She had listened like an iceberg while he told the story he had prepared, and then, well, she didn't actually call him a liar, but she gave him to understand in a general sort of way that if he and Dr. Cook ever happened to meet and started swapping stories, it would be about the biggest duel on record. And then he had crawled away with the kid, licked to a splinter. "And mind, this is your affair," he concluded. "I'm not mixed up in it at all. If you want to escape your sentence, you better go and find the kid's parents and return him before the police come for you." By Jove, you know, till I started to tramp the place with this infernal kid, I never had a notion it would have been so deuced difficult to restore a child to its anxious parents. It's a mystery to me how kidnappers ever get caught. I searched Marvis Bay like a bloodhound, but nobody came forward to claim the infant. You'd have thought, from the lack of interest in him, that he was stopping there all by himself in a cottage of his own. It was until, by an inspiration, I thought to ask the sweet stall man that I'd found out his name was Medwin, and that his parents lived at a place called Ocean Rest, in Beach Road. I shot off there like an arrow and knocked at the door. Nobody answered. I knocked again. I could hear movement inside, but nobody came. I was just going to get to work on that knocker in such a way that the idea would filter through into these people's heads that I wasn't standing there just for the fun of the thing, when a voice from somewhere above shouted, "Hi!" I looked up and saw a round pink face, with grey whiskers east and west of it, staring down from an upper window. "Hi!" it shouted again. "What the deuce do you mean by hi?" I said. "You can't come in," said the face. "Hello, is that Toodles?" "My name is not Toodles, and I don't want to come in," I said. "Are you Mr. Medwin? I've brought back your son." "I see him." "Peep-o, Toodles, Dada can see you." The voice disappeared with a jerk. I could hear voices. The face reappeared. "Hi!" I churned the gravel madly. "Do you live here?" said the face. "I'm staying here for a few weeks." "What's your name?" "Pepper, but—" "Pepper? Any relation to Edward Pepper, the colliery owner?" "My uncle. But I used to know him well. Dear old Edward Pepper. I wish I was with him now." "I wish you were," I said. He beamed down at me. "This is most fortunate," he said. "We were wondering what we were to do with Toodles. You see, we have the mumps here. My daughter Boodles has just developed mumps. Toodles must not be exposed to the risk of infection. We could not think what we were to do with him. It was most fortunate your finding him. He strayed from his nurse. I would hesitate to trust him to the care of a stranger, but you are different. Any nephew of Edward Pepper's has my implicit confidence. You must take Toodles to your house. It will be an ideal arrangement. I have written to my brother in London to come and fetch him. He may be here in a few days." "May?" "He is a busy man, of course, but he should certainly be here within a week. Till then Toodles can stop with you. It's an excellent plan. Very obliged to you. Your wife will like Toodles." "I haven't got a wife," I yelled, but the window had closed with a bang, as if the man with the whiskers had found a germ trying to escape, don't you know, and had headed it off just in time. I breathed a deep breath and wiped my forehead. The window flew up again. "Hi!" A package weighing about a ton hit me on the head and burst like a bomb. "Did you catch it?" said the face, reappearing. "Dear me, you missed it. Never mind, you can get it at the grocer's. Ask for Bailey's granulated breakfast chips. Toodles loves them for breakfast with a little milk. Be certain to get Bailey's." My spirit was broken, if you know what I mean. I accepted the situation. Taking Toodles by the hand, I walked slowly away. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was a picnic by the side of it. As we turned up the road, we met Freddy's Angela. The sight of her had a marked effect on the kid Toodles. He pointed at her and said, "Wah!" The girl stopped and smiled. I loosed the kid and he ran to her. "Well, baby," she said, bending down to him, "so father found you again, did he? Your little son and I made friends on the beach this morning," she said to me. This was the limit. Coming on top of that interview with the whiskered lunatic, it so utterly unnerved me, don't you know, that she had nodded good-bye and was halfway down the road before I caught up with my breath enough to deny the charge of being the infant's father. I hadn't expected dear old Freddy to sing with joy when he found out what had happened, but I did think he might have shown a little more manly fortitude. He leaped up, glared at the kid, and clutched his head. He didn't speak for a long time, but, on the other hand, when he began he did not leave off for a long time. He was quite emotional, dear old boy. It beat me where he could have picked up such expressions. "Well," he said when he had finished, "say something. Heavens, man, why don't you say something?" "You don't give me a chance, old top," I said soothingly. "What are you going to do about it?" "What can we do about it?" "We can't spend our time acting as nurses to this exhibit." He got up. "I'm going back to London," he said. "Freddy!" I cried. "Freddy, old man!" My voice shook. "Would you desert a pal at a time like this?" "I would. This is your business, and you've got to manage it." "Freddy," I said, "you've got to stand by me. You must. Do you realize that this child has to be undressed and bathed and dressed again? You wouldn't leave me to do all that single-handed. Freddy, old scout, we were at school together. Your mother likes me. You owe me a tenner." He sat down again. "Oh, well," he said resignedly. "Besides, old top," I said, "I did it all for your sake, don't you know?" He looked at me in a curious way. "Reggie," he said in a strained voice, "one moment. I'll stand a good deal, but I won't stand for being expected to be grateful." Looking back at it, I see that what saved me from Colney Hatch in that crisis was my bright idea of buying up most of the contents of the local sweet shop. By serving out sweets to the kid practically incessantly, we managed to get through the rest of that day pretty satisfactorily. At 8 o'clock he fell asleep in a chair, and, having undressed him by unbuttoning every button in sight, and where there were no buttons, pulling till something gave, we carried him up to bed. Freddy stood looking at the pile of clothes on the floor, and I knew what he was thinking. To get the kid undressed had been simple, a mere matter of muscle. But how were we going to get him into his clothes again? I stirred the pile with my foot. There was a long linen arrangement which might have been anything, also a strip of pink flannel which was like nothing on earth. We looked at each other and smiled wanly. But in the morning I remembered that there were children at the next bungalow but one. We went there before breakfast and borrowed their nurse. Women are wonderful. By George, they are. She had that kid dressed and looking fit for anything in about 8 minutes. I showered wealth on her, and she promised to come in morning and evening. I sat down to breakfast almost cheerful again. It was the first bit of silver lining there had been to the cloud up to date. "And after all," I said, "there's lots to be said for having a child about the house, if you know what I mean. Kind of cozy and domestic, what?" Just then the kid upset the milk over Freddy's trousers, and when he had come back after changing his clothes, he began to talk about what a much-maligned man King Herod was. The more he saw of Toodles, he said, the less he wondered at those impulsive views of his on infanticide. 2 days later Jimmy Pinkerton came down. Jimmy took one look at the kid, who happened to be howling at the moment, and picked up his portmanteau. "For me," he said, "the hotel. I can't write dialogue with that sort of thing going on. Whose work is this? Which of you adopted this little treasure?" I told him about Mr. Medwind and the mumps. Jimmy seemed interested. "I might work this up for the stage," he said. "It wouldn't make a bad situation for an Act 2 of a farce." "Farce," snarled poor old Freddy. "Rather. Curtain of Act 1 on hero. A well-meaning, half-baked sort of idiot, just like— that is to say, a well-meaning, half-baked sort of idiot, kidnapping the child. Second act, his adventures with it. I'll rough it out tonight. Come along and show me to the hotel, Reggie." As we went, I told him the rest of the story, the Angela part. He laid down his portmanteau and looked at me like an owl through his glasses. "What?" he said. "Why, hang it, this is a play ready-made. It's the old tiny hand business. Always safe stuff. Parted lovers, lisping child, reconciliation over the little cradle. It's big. Child, center. Girl, left center. Freddy, upstage by the piano. Can Freddy play the piano?" "He can play a little of the rosary with one finger." Jimmy shook his head. "No, we shall have to cut out the soft music. But the rest's all right. Look here." He squatted in the sand. "This stone is the girl. This bit of seaweed's the child. This nutshell is Freddy. Dialogue leading up to child's line. Child speaks like, 'Book for lady, does you love dada?' Business of outstretched hands. Hold picture for a moment. Freddy crosses left, takes girl's hand. Business of swallowing lump in throat. Then big speech. 'Ah, Marie,' or whatever her name is. Jane, Agnes, Angela? Very well. 'Ah, Angela, has not this gone on too long? A little child rebukes us, Angela,' and so on. Freddy must work up his own part. I'm just giving you the general outline. We must get a good line for the child. 'Boo for lady, does oo love dada' isn't definite enough. We want something more, kiss Freddy. That's it. Short, crisp, and has the punch." "But, Jimmy, old top," I said, "the only objection is, don't you know, that there's no way of getting the girl to the cottage. She cuts Freddy. She wouldn't come within a mile of him." Jimmy frowned. "That's awkward," he said. "Well, we shall have to make it an exterior set instead of an interior. We can easily corner her on the beach somewhere when we're ready. Meanwhile, we must get the kid letter perfect. First rehearsal for lines and business 11 sharp tomorrow." Poor old Freddy was in such a gloomy state of mind that we decided not to tell him the idea till we had finished coaching the kid. He wasn't in the mood to have a thing like that hanging over him. So we concentrated on Toodles. And pretty early in the proceedings, we saw that the only way to get Toodles worked up to the spirit of the thing was to introduce sweets of some sort as sub-motive, so to speak. "The chief difficulty," said Jimmy Pickerton at the end of the first rehearsal, "is to establish a connection in the kid's mind between his line and the sweets. Once he has grasped the basic fact that those two words, clearly spoken, result automatically in acid drops, we have got a success. I've often thought, don't you know, how interesting it must be to be one of those animal trainer Johnnies, to stimulate the dawning intelligence and that sort of thing. Well, this was every bit as exciting. Some days success seemed to be staring us in the eye, and the kid got the line out as if he'd been an old professional, and then he'd go all to pieces again, and time was flying. "We must hurry up, Jimmy," I said. "The kid's uncle may arrive any day now and take him away." "And we haven't an understudy," said Jimmy. "There's something in that. We must work. My goodness, that kid's a bad study. I have known deaf-mutes who have learned the part quicker. I will say this for the kid, though. He was a trier. Failure didn't discourage him. Whenever there was any kind of sweet near, he had a dash at his line, and kept on saying something till he got what he was after. His only fault was his uncertainty. Personally, I would have been prepared to risk it, and start the performance at the first opportunity, but Jimmy said no. "We're not nearly ready," said Jimmy. "Today, for instance, he said kick Freddie. That's not going to win any girl's heart, and she might do it, too. No, we must postpone production a while yet." But, by George, we didn't. The curtain went up that very next afternoon. It was nobody's fault, certainly not mine. It was just fate. Freddie had settled down at the piano, and I was leading the kid out of the house to exercise it, when, just as we got out to the veranda, along came the girl Angela on her way to the beach. The kid set up his usual yell at the sight of her, and she stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello, baby," she said. "Good morning," she said to me. "May I come up?" She didn't wait for an answer. She just came. She seemed to be that sort of girl. She came up on the veranda and started fussing over the kid. And 6 feet away, mind you, Freddie smiting the piano in the sitting room. It was a dashed disturbing situation, don't you know. At any minute Freddie might take it into his head to come out onto the veranda, and we hadn't even begun to rehearse him in his part. I tried to break up the scene. "We were just going down to the beach," I said. "Yes," said the girl. She listened for a moment. "So you're having your piano tuned?" she said. "My aunt has been trying to find a tuner for hours. Do you mind if I go in and tell this man to come on to us when he's finished here?" Not yet," I said. "Not yet, if you don't mind. He can't bear to be disturbed when he's working. It's the artistic temperament. I'll tell him later." "Very well," she said, getting up to go. "Ask him to come to Pine Bungalow. West is the surname. Oh, he seems to have stopped. I suppose he'll be out in a minute now. I'll wait." "Don't you think... shouldn't we be going to the beach?" I said. She had started talking to the kid and didn't hear. She was feeling in her pocket for something. "The beach," I babbled. "See what I've brought for you, baby?" she said, and by George, don't you know, she held up in front of the kid's bulging eyes a chunk of toffee the size of the Automobile Club. That finished it. We had just been having a long rehearsal, and the kid was all worked up in his part. He got it right the first time. "Kiss Freddie!" he shouted. And the front door opened, and Freddie came out onto the veranda for all the world as if he had been taking a cue. He looked at the girl, and the girl looked at him. I looked at the ground, and the kid looked at the toffee. "Kiss Freddie!" he yelled. "Kiss Freddie!" The girl was still holding up the toffee, and the kid did what Jimmy Pinkerton would have called business of outstretched hands towards it. "Kiss Freddie!" he shrieked. "What does this mean?" said the girl, turning to me. "You'd better give it to him, don't you know?" I said. "He'll go on till you do." She gave the kid his toffee, and he subsided. Poor old Freddie still stood there, gaping, without a word. "What does it mean?" said the girl again. Her face was pink, and her eyes were sparkling in that sort of way, don't you know, that makes a fellow feel as if he hadn't any bones in him, if you know what I mean. Did you ever tread on your partner's dress at a dance and tear it, and see her smile at you like an angel and say, "Please don't apologize, it's nothing," and then suddenly meet her clear blue eyes and feel as if you had stepped on the teeth of a rake and had the handle jump up and hit you in the face? Well, that's how Freddie's Angela looked. "Well," she said, and her teeth gave a little click. I gulped. Then I said it was nothing. Then I said it was nothing much. Then I said, "Oh, well, it was this way," and after a few brief remarks about Jimmy Pinkerton, I told her all about it. And all the while idiot Freddie stood there gaping without a word. And the girl didn't speak either. She just stood listening. And then she began to laugh. I never heard a girl laugh so much. She leaned against the side of the veranda and shrieked. And all the while Freddie, the world's champion chump, stood there saying nothing. Well, I sidled towards the steps. I had said all I had to say, and it seemed to me that about here the stage direction exit was written in my part. I gave poor old Freddie up in despair. If only he had said a word, it might have been all right. But there he stood, speechless. What can a fellow do with a fellow like that? Just out of sight of the house I met Jimmy Pinkerton. "Hello, Reggie," he said. "I was just coming to you. Where's the kid? We must have a big rehearsal today." "No good," I said sadly. "It's all over. The thing's finished. Poor dear old Freddie has made an ass of himself and killed the whole show." "Tell me," said Jimmy. I told him. "Fluffed his lines, did he?" said Jimmy, nodding thoughtfully. "It's always the way with these amateurs. We must go back at once. Things look bad, but it may not be too late," he said as we started. "Even now, a few well-chosen words from a man of the world and—" "Great Scott!" I cried. "Look!" In front of the cottage stood 6 children, a nurse, and the fellow from the grocer's, staring. From the windows of the houses opposite projected about 400 heads of both sexes staring. Down the road came galloping 5 more children, a dog, 3 men, and a boy, about to stare. And on our porch, as unconscious of the spectators as if they had been alone in the Sahara, stood Freddie and Angela, clasped in each other's arms. Dear old Freddie may have been fluffy in his lines, but, by George, his business had certainly gone with a bang. 6. Rallying around George. I think one of the rummiest affairs I was ever mixed up with, in the course of a lifetime devoted to butting into other people's business, was that affair of George Latimer at Monte Carlo. I wouldn't bore you, don't you know, for the world, but I think you ought to hear about it. We had come to Monte Carlo on the yacht Kirke, belonging to an old sportsman of the name of Marshall. Among those present were myself, my man Vowles, a Mrs. Vanderley, her daughter Stella, Mrs. Vanderley's maid Pilbeam, and George. George was a dear old pal of mine. In fact, it was I who had worked him into the party. You see, George was due to meet his Uncle Augustus, who was scheduled, George having just reached his 25th birthday, to hand over to him a legacy left by one of George's aunts, for which he had been trustee. The aunt had died when George was quite a kid. It was a date that George had been looking forward to, for though he had a sort of income, an income after all is only an income, whereas a chunk of goblins is a pile. George's uncle was in Monte Carlo, and he had written George that he would come to London and unbelt. But it struck me that a far better plan was for George to go to his uncle at Monte Carlo instead. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, don't you know? Fix up his affairs and have a pleasant holiday simultaneously. So George had tagged along, and at the time when the trouble started, we were anchored in Monaco Harbour, and Uncle Augustus was due next day. Looking back, I may say that, so far as I was mixed up in it, the thing began at 7 o'clock in the morning, when I was aroused from a dreamless sleep by the dickens of a scrap in progress outside my stateroom door. The chief ingredients were a female voice that sobbed and said, "Oh, Harold," and a male voice, raised in anger, as they say, which after considerable difficulty I identified as Vowles's. I hardly recognized it. In his official capacity, Vowles talks exactly like you'd expect a statue to talk, if it could. In private, however, he evidently relaxed to some extent, and to have that sort of thing going on in my midst at that hour was too much for me. "Vowles!" I yelled. Spion Kop ceased with a jerk. There was a silence, then sobs diminishing in the distance, and finally a tap at the door. Vowles entered with that impressive "My lord, the carriage waits" look, which is what I pay him for. You wouldn't have believed he had a drop of any sort of emotion in him. "Vowles," I said, "are you under the delusion that I am going to be Queen of the May? You've called me early, all right. It's only just 7. "I understand you to summon me, sir." "I summoned you to find out why you were making that infernal noise outside." "I owe you an apology, sir. I am afraid that in the heat of the moment I raised my voice." "It's a wonder you didn't raise the roof. Who was that with you?" "Miss Pilbeam, sir, Mrs. Vanderley's maid." "What was all that trouble about?" "I was breaking our engagement, sir." I couldn't help gaping. Somehow one didn't associate vows with engagements. Then it struck me that I'd no right to butt in on his secret sorrows, so I switched the conversation. "I think I'll get up," I said. "Yes, sir." "I can't wait to breakfast with the rest. Can you get me some right away?" "Yes, sir." So I had a solitary breakfast and went up on the deck to smoke. It was a lovely morning. Blue sea, gleaming casino, cloudless sky, and all the rest of the hippodrome. Presently the others began to trickle up. Stella Vanderley was one of the first. I thought she looked a bit pale and tired. She said she hadn't slept well. That accounted for it. Unless you get your 8 hours, where are you? "Seen George?" I asked. I couldn't help thinking the name seemed to freeze her a bit, which was queer, because all the voyage she and George had been particularly close pals. In fact, at any moment I expected George to come to me and slip his little hand in mine and whisper, "I've done it, old scout. She loves me." "I have not seen Mr. Latimer," she said. I didn't pursue the subject. George's stock was apparently low that a.m. The next item in the day's program occurred a few minutes later, when the morning papers arrived. Mrs. Vanderley opened hers and gave a scream. "The poor dear prince," she said. "What a shocking thing," said old Marshall. "I knew him in Vienna," said Mrs. Vanderley. "He waltzed divinely." Then I got at mine and saw what they were talking about. The paper was full of it. It seemed that late the night before, His Serene Highness the Prince of Saxe-Burg-Liegnitz, I always wonder why they call these chaps serene, had been murderously assaulted in a dark street on his way back from the casino to his yacht. Apparently he had developed the habit of going out without an escort, and some roughneck, taking advantage of this, had laid for him and slugged him with considerable vim. The prince had been found lying pretty well beaten up and insensible in the street by a passing pedestrian, and had been taken back to his yacht, where he still lay unconscious. "This is going to do somebody no good," I said. "What do you get for slugging a Serene Highness? I wonder if they'll catch the fellow." "Later," read old Marshall, "the pedestrian who discovered His Serene Highness proves to have been Mr. Denman Sturgis, the eminent private investigator. Mr. Sturgis has offered his services to the police, and is understood to be in possession of a most important clue. That's the fellow who had charge of that kidnapping case in Chicago. If anybody can catch the man, he can." About 5 minutes later, just as the rest of them were going to move off to breakfast, a boat hailed us and came alongside. A tall, thin man came up the gangway. He looked round the group and fixed on old Marshall as the probable owner of the yacht. "Good morning," he said. "I believe you have a Mr. Latimer on board, Mr. George Latimer?" "Yes," said Marshall. "He's down below. Want to see him? Whom shall I say?" "He would not know my name. I should like to see him for a moment on somewhat urgent business." "Take a seat. He'll be up in a moment. Reggie, my boy, go and hurry him up." I went down to George's stateroom. "George, old man," I shouted. No answer. I opened the door and went in. The room was empty. What's more, the bunk hadn't been slept in. I don't know when I've been more surprised. I went on deck. "He isn't there," I said. "Not there," said old Marshall. "Where is he, then? Perhaps he's gone for a stroll ashore. But he'll be back soon for breakfast. You better wait for him. Have you breakfasted? No? Then will you join us?" The man said he would, and just then the gong went and they trooped down, leaving me alone on the deck. I sat smoking and thinking, and then smoking a bit more, when I thought I heard somebody call my name in a sort of hoarse whisper. I looked over my shoulder, and, by Jove, there at the top of the gangway, in evening dress, dusty to the eyebrows and without a hat, was dear old George. "Great Scott!" I cried. "Shh!" he whispered. "Anyone about?" "They're all down at breakfast." He gave a sigh of relief, sank into my chair, and closed his eyes. I regarded him with pity. The poor old boy looked a wreck. "I say," I said, touching him on the shoulder. He leaped out of the chair with a smothering yell. "Did you do that? What did you do it for? What's the sense of it? How do you suppose you can ever make yourself popular if you go about touching people on the shoulder? My nerves are sticking a yard out of my body this morning, Reggie." "Yes, old boy." I did a murder last night."
"What?"
"It's the sort of thing that might happen to anybody. Directly Stella Vanderley broke off our engagement—"
"Broke off your engagement?
How long were you engaged?" "About 2 minutes. It might have been less. I hadn't a stopwatch. I proposed to her at 10 last night in the saloon. She accepted me. I was just going to kiss her when we heard someone coming. I went out. Coming along the corridor was that infernal what's-her-name, Mrs. Vanderley's maid, Pilbeam. Have you ever been accepted by a girl you love, Reggie?" "Never. I've been refused dozens. Then you won't understand how I felt. I was off my head with joy. I hardly knew what I was doing. I just felt I had to kiss the nearest thing handy. I couldn't wait. It might have been the ship's cat. It wasn't. It was Pilbeam."
"You kissed her?"
"I kissed her. And just at that moment the door of the saloon opened, and out came Stella."
"Great Scott!"
"Exactly what I said. It flashed across me that to Stella, dear girl, not knowing the circumstances, the thing might seem a little odd. It did. She broke off the engagement, and I got out the dinghy and rowed off. I was mad. I didn't care what became of me. I simply wanted to forget. I went ashore. It's just on the cards that I may have drowned my sorrows a bit. Anyhow, I don't remember a thing, except that I can recollect having the deuce of a scrap with somebody in a dark street, and somebody falling, and myself licking it for all I was worth. I woke up this morning in the casino gardens. I've lost my hat." I dived for the paper. "Read," I said. "It's all there." He read. "Good heavens," he said. "You didn't do a thing to his serene nibs, did you? Reggie, this is awful. Cheer up. They'll say he'll recover." "That doesn't matter. It does to him." He read the paper again. "It says they've a clue." "They always say that." "But my hat." "Eh?" "My hat. I must have dropped it during the scrap. This man Denman Sturgis must have found it. It had my name in it." "George," I said, "you mustn't waste time." "Oh!" He jumped a foot in the air. "Don't do it," he said irritably. "Don't bark like that. What's the matter?" "The man." "What man?" "A tall, thin man with an eye like a gimlet. He arrived just before you did. He's down in the saloon now, having breakfast. He said he wanted to see you on business, and wouldn't give his name. I didn't like the look of him from the first. It's this fellow Sturgis. It must be." "No." "I feel it. I'm sure of it." "Had he a hat?" "Of course he had a hat." "Fool, I mean mine. Was he carrying a hat?" "By Jove, he was carrying a parcel." "George, old scout, you must get a move on. You must light out if you want to spend the rest of your life out of prison. Slugging a Serene Highness is lèse majesté. It's worse than hitting a policeman. You haven't got a moment to waste." "But I haven't any money. Reggie, old man, lend me a tenner or something. I must get over the frontier into Italy at once. I'll wire my uncle to meet me in—" "Look out," I cried. "There's someone coming." He dived out of sight just as Vowles came up the companionway, carrying a letter on a tray. "What's the matter?" I said. "What do you want?" "I beg your pardon, sir. I thought I heard Mr. Latimer's voice. A letter has arrived for him." "He isn't here." "No, sir. Shall I remove the letter?" "No, give it to me. I'll give it to him when he comes." "Very good, sir." "Oh, Vowles, are they all still at breakfast? The gentleman who came to see Mr. Latimer still hard at it?" "He is at present occupied with a kippered herring, sir." "Ah, that's all, Vowles. Thank you, sir." He retired. I called to George, and he came out. "Who was it?" "Only Vowles. He brought a letter for you. They're all at breakfast still, the sleuths eating kippers. That'll hold him for a bit, full of bones." He began to read his letter. He gave a kind of grunt of surprise at the first paragraph. "Well, I'm hanged," he said as he finished. "Reggie, this is a queer thing." "How's that?" He handed me the letter, and directly I started in on it. I saw why he had grunted. This is how it ran. "My dear George, I shall be seeing you tomorrow, I hope. But I think it is better, before we meet, to prepare you for a curious situation that has arisen in connection with the legacy which your father inherited from your Aunt Emily, and which you are expecting me, as trustee, to hand over to you, now that you have reached your 25th birthday. You have doubtless heard your father speak of your twin brother, Alfred, who was lost or kidnapped, which was never ascertained, when you were both babies. When no news was received of him for so many years, it was supposed that he was dead. Yesterday, however, I received a letter purporting that he had been living all this time in Buenos Aires as the adopted son of a wealthy South American, and has only recently discovered his identity. He states that he is on his way to meet me, and will arrive any day now. Of course, like other claimants, he may prove to be an impostor, but meanwhile his intervention will, I fear, cause a certain delay before I can hand over your money to you. It will be necessary to go into a thorough examination of credentials, etc., and this will take some time. But I will go fully into the matter with you when we meet. Your affectionate uncle, Augustus Arbut. I read it through twice, and the second time I had one of those ideas I do sometimes get, though admittedly a chump of the premier class. I have seldom had such a thoroughly corking brainwave. "Why, old top," I said, "this lets you out." "Lets me out of half the darned money, if that's what you mean. If this chap's not an impostor, and there's no earthly reason to suppose he is, though I've never heard my father say a word about him, we shall have to split the money. Aunt Emily's will left the money to my father, or, failing him, his offspring. I thought that meant me, but apparently there are a crowd of us. I'll call it rotten work, springing unexpected offspring on a fellow at the 11th hour like this." "Why, you chump," I said, "it's going to save you. This lets you out of your spectacular dash across the frontier. All you've got to do is to stay here and be your brother Alfred. It came to me in a flash." He looked at me in a kind of dazed way. "You ought to be in some sort of a home, Reggie." "Ass," I cried, "don't you understand? Have you ever heard of twin brothers who weren't exactly alike? Who's to say you aren't Alfred if you swear you are? Your uncle will be there to back you up that you have a brother Alfred. And Alfred will be there to call me a liar." "He won't. It's not as if you have to keep it up for the rest of your life. It's only for an hour or two, till we can get this detective off the yacht. We sail for England tomorrow morning." At last the thing seemed to sink into him. His face brightened. "Why, I really do believe it would work," he said. "Of course it would work. If they want proof, show them your mole. I'll swear George hadn't one." And as Alfred, I should get a chance of talking to Stella and making things all right for George. "Reggie, old top, you're a genius." "No, no." "You are." "Well, it's only sometimes. I can't keep it up." And just then there was a gentle cough behind us. We spun around. "What the devil are you doing there, Vowles?" I said. "I beg your pardon, sir. I have heard all." I looked at George. George looked at me. "Vowles is all right," I said. "Decent Vowles. Vowles wouldn't give us away, would you, Vowles?" "Yes, sir." "You would?" "Yes, sir." "But Vowles, old man," I said, "be sensible. What would you gain by it?" "Financially, nothing, sir." "Whereas by keeping quiet," I tapped him on the chest, "by holding your tongue, Vowles, by saying nothing about it to anybody, Vowles, old fellow, you might gain a considerable sum." "Am I to understand, sir, that because you are rich and I am poor, you think you can buy my self-respect?" "Oh, come," I said. "How much?" said Vowles. So we switched to terms. You wouldn't believe the way the man haggled. You'd have thought a decent, faithful servant would have been delighted to oblige one in a little matter like that for a fiver, but not Vowles, by no means. It was 100 down, and the promise of another 100 when we got safely away, before he was satisfied. But we fixed it up at last, and poor old George got down to his stateroom and changed his clothes. He'd hardly gone when the breakfast party came on deck. "Did you meet him?" I asked. "Meet whom?" said old Marshall. "George's twin brother, Alfred." "I didn't know George had a brother." "Nor did he till yesterday. It's a long story. He was kidnapped in infancy and everyone thought he was dead. George had a letter from his uncle about him yesterday. I shouldn't wonder if that's where George has gone, to see his uncle and find out about it. In the meantime, Alfred has arrived. He's down in George's stateroom now, having a brush-up. It'll amaze you, the likeness between them. You think it is George at first. Well, look, here he comes." And up came George, brushed and clean, in an ordinary yachting suit. They were rattled. There was no doubt about that. They stood looking at him as if they thought there was a catch somewhere, but weren't quite certain where it was. I introduced him, and still they looked doubtful. "Mr. Pepper tells me my brother is not on board," said George. "It's an amazing likeness," said old Marshall. "Is my brother like me?" asked George amiably. "No one could tell you apart," I said. "I suppose twins always are alike," said George. "But if it ever came to a question of identification, there would be one way of distinguishing us. Do you know George well, Mr. Pepper?" "He's an old pal of mine." "You've been swimming with him, perhaps?" "Every day last August." "Well, then, you would have noticed it if he had a mole like this on the back of his neck, wouldn't you?" He turned his back and stooped and showed the mole. His collar hid it in ordinary times. I had seen it often when we were bathing together. "Has George a mole like that?" he asked. "No," I said. "Oh, no." "You would have noticed if he had?" "Yes," I said. "Oh, yes." "I'm glad of that," said George. "It would be a nuisance not to be able to prove one's own identity." That seemed to satisfy them all. They couldn't get away from it. It seemed to me that from now on the thing was a walkover. And I think George felt the same, for when old Marshall asked him if he had had breakfast, he said he had not, went below, and pitched in as if he hadn't a care in the world. Everything went right till lunchtime. George sat in the shade on the foredeck talking to Stella most of the time. "It's all right," he said. "What did I tell you?" "What did you tell me?" "Why, about Stella. Didn't I say that Alfred would fix things up for George? I told her she looked worried, and got her to tell me what the trouble was, and then you must have shown a flash of speed if you got her to confide in you after knowing you for about 2 hours. "Perhaps I did," said George modestly. "I had no notion till I became him what a persuasive sort of chap my brother Alfred was. Anyway, she told me all about it, and I started in to show her that George was a pretty good sort of fellow on the whole, who oughtn't to be turned down for what was evidently merely temporary insanity. She saw my point." "And it's all right?" "Absolutely. If only we could produce George. How much longer does that infernal sleuth intend to stay here? He seems to have taken root." "I fancy he thinks that you're bound to come back sooner or later, and is waiting for you." "He's an absolute nuisance," said George. We were moving towards the companionway to go below for lunch when a boat hailed us. We went to the side and looked over. "It's my uncle," said George. A stout man came up the gangway. "Hallo, George," he said. "Get my letter?" "I think you are mistaking me for my brother," said George. "My name is Alfred Latimer." "What's that?" "I am George's brother Alfred. Are you my Uncle Augustus?" The stout man stared at him. "You're very like George," he said. "So everyone tells me." "And you're really Alfred?" "I am." "I'd like to talk business with you for a moment." He cocked his eye at me. I sidled off and went below. At the foot of the companion steps I met Vowles. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Vowles. "If it would be convenient, I should be glad to have the afternoon off." I'm bound to say I rather liked his manner. Absolutely normal, not a trace of the fellow conspirator about it. I gave him the afternoon off. I had lunch. George didn't show up, and as I was going out I was waylaid by the girl Pilbeam. She had been crying. "I beg your pardon, sir, but did Vowles ask you for the afternoon?" I didn't see what business it was of hers, but she seemed all worked up about it, so I told her. Yes, I gave him the afternoon off. She broke down, absolutely collapsed. Devilish unpleasant it was. I'm hopeless in a situation like this. After I'd said, there, which didn't seem to help much, I hadn't any remarks to make. He said he was going to the tables to gamble away all his savings and then shoot himself because he had nothing left to live for." I suddenly remembered the scrap in the small hours outside my stateroom door. I hate mysteries. I meant to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't have a real first-class valet like Vowles going about the place shooting himself up. Evidently the girl Pilbeam was at the bottom of the thing. I questioned her. She sobbed. I questioned her more. I was firm. And eventually she yielded up the facts. Vowles had seen George kiss her the night before. That was the trouble. Things began to piece themselves together. I went to interview George. There was going to be another job for persuasive Alfred. Vowles's mind had to be eased as Stella's had been. I couldn't afford to lose a fellow with his genius for preserving a trouser crease. I found George on the foredeck. What is it Shakespeare or somebody says about some fellow's face being sicklied over with a pale cast of care? George's was like that. He looked green. "Finished with your uncle?" I said. He grinned a ghostly grin. "There isn't any uncle," he said. "There isn't any Alfred. And there isn't any money." "Explain yourself, old top," I said. "It won't take long. The old crook has spent every penny of the trust money. He's been at it for years, ever since I was a kid. When the time came to cough up, and I was due to see what he did, he went to the tables in the hope of a run of luck, and lost the last remnant of his stuff. He had to find a way of holding me for a while and postponing the squaring of accounts while he got away, and he invented this twin brother business. He knew I should find out sooner or later, but meanwhile he would be able to get off to South America, which he has done. He's on his way now." "You let him go?" "Oh, what could I do? I can't afford to make a fuss with that man Sturgis around. I can't prove there's no Alfred when my only chance of avoiding prison is to be Alfred." "Well, you've made things right for yourself with Stella Vanderley anyway," I said, trying to cheer him up. "What's the good of that now? I've hardly any money and no prospects. How can I marry her?" I pondered. "It looks to me, old top," I said at last, "as if things were in a bit of a mess." "You've guessed it," said poor old George. I spent the afternoon musing on life. If you come to think of it, what a queer thing life is. So unlike anything else, don't you know, if you see what I mean. At any moment you may be strolling peacefully along, and all the time life's waiting around the corner to fetch you one. You can't tell when you may be going to get it. It's all dashed puzzling. Here was poor old George, as well-meaning a fellow as ever stepped, getting swatted all over the ring by the hand of fate. Why? That's what I asked myself. Just life, don't you know? That's all there was about it. It was close on 6 o'clock when our third visitor of the day arrived. We were sitting on the afterdeck in the cool of the evening, old Marshall, Denman Sturgis, Mrs. Vanderley, Stella, George, and I, when he came up. We had been talking of George, and old Marshall was suggesting the advisability of sending out search parties. He was worried. So was Stella Vanderley. So, for the matter, were George and I, only not for the same reason. We were just arguing the thing out when the visitor arrived. He was a well-built, stiff sort of fellow. He spoke with a German accent. "Mr. Marshall," he said, "I am Count Fritz von Kozlin, equerry to his Serene Highness." He clicked his heels together and saluted. "The Prince of Saxburg-Leignitz." Mrs. Vanderley jumped up. "Why, Count," she said, "what ages since we met in Vienna? You remember?" "Could I ever forget? And the charming Miss Stella, she is well, I suppose not?" "Stella, you remember Count Fritz?" Stella shook hands with him. "And how is the poor dear prince?" asked Mrs. Vanderley. "What a terrible thing to have happened." "I rejoice to say that my high-born master is better. He has regained consciousness and is sitting up and taking nourishment." "That's good," said old Marshall. "In a spoon only," sighed the Count. "Mr. Marshall, with your permission, I should like a word with Mr. Sturgis." "Mr. who?" The gimlet-eyed sportsman came forward. "I am Denman Sturgis, at your service." "The deuce you are! What are you doing here?" "Mr. Sturgis," explained the Count, "graciously volunteered his services "I know, but what's he doing here?" "I am waiting for Mr. George Latimer, Mr. Marshal." "Eh?" "You have not found him?" asked the Count anxiously. "Not yet, Count, but I hope to do so shortly. I know what he looks like now. This gentleman is his twin brother. They are doubles." "You are sure this gentleman is not Mr. George Latimer?" George put his foot down firmly on the suggestion. "Don't go mixing me up with my brother," he said. "I'm Alfred. You can tell by my mole." He exhibited the mole. He was taking no risks. The Count clicked his tongue regretfully. "I am sorry," he said. George didn't offer to console him. "Don't worry," said Sturgis. "He won't escape me. I shall find him." "Do, Mr. Sturgis, do, and quickly. Find swiftly the noble young man." "What?" shouted George. "That noble young man, George Latimer, who at the risk of his life saved my high-born master from the assassin." George sat down suddenly. "I don't understand," he said feebly. "We were wrong, Mr. Sturgis," went on the Count. "We leaped to the conclusion, was it not so, that the owner of the hat you found was also the assailant of my high-born master. We were wrong. I have heard the story from His Serene Highness's own lips. He was passing down a dark street when a ruffian in a mask sprang out upon him. Doubtless he had been followed from the casino, where he had been winning heavily. My high-born master was taken by surprise. He was felled. But before he lost consciousness, he perceived a young man in evening dress, wearing the hat you found, running swiftly towards him. The hero engaged the assassin in combat, and my high-born master remembers no more. His Serene Highness asks repeatedly, 'Where is my brave preserver?' His gratitude is princely. He seeks for this man to reward him. Ah, you should be proud of your brother, sir." "Thanks," said George limply. "And you, Mr. Sturgis, you must redouble your efforts. You must search the land. You must scour the sea to find George Latimer." "He needn't take all the trouble," said a voice from the gangway. It was Vowles. His face was flushed, his hat was on the back of his head, and he was smoking a fat cigar. "I'll tell you where to find George Latimer," he shouted. He glared at George, who was staring at him. "Yes, look at me," he yelled. "Look at me! You won't be the first this afternoon who stared at the mysterious stranger who's won for 2 hours without a break. I'll be even with you now, Mr. Blooming Latimer. I'll learn you to break a poor man's heart. Mr. Marshal and gents, this morning I was on deck, and I overheard him plotting up a game on you. They'd spotted that gent there as a detective, and they arranged that Blooming Latimer was to pass himself off as his own twin brother. And if you wanted proof, Blooming Pepper tells them to show him his mole, and he'd swear George hadn't one. Those were his very words. That man there is George Latimer, Esquire, and let him deny it if he can." George got up. "I haven't the least desire to deny it, Vowles." "Mr. Vowles, if you please." "It's true," said George, turning to the Count. "The fact is, I had a rather foggy recollection of what happened last night. I only remember knocking someone down, and, like you, I jumped to the conclusion that I must have assaulted His Serene Highness." "Then you are really George Latimer?" asked the Count. "I am." "'Ere, what does all this mean?" demanded Vowles. "Merely that I saved the life of His Serene Highness, the Prince of Saxburg-Liegnitz, Mr. Vowles." "It's a swindle," began Vowles, when there was a sudden rush, and the girl Pilbeam cannoned into the crowd, sending me into old Marshall's chair, and flung herself into the arms of Vowles. "Oh, Harold," she cried, "I thought you were dead. I thought you'd shot yourself." He sort of braced himself together to fling her off, and then seemed to think better of it and fell into the clinch. It was all dashed romantic, don't you know, but there are limits. "Vowles, you're sacked," I said. "Who cares?" he said. "Think I was going to stop now I'm a gentleman of property? Come along, Emma, my dear. Give a month's notice and get your 'at, and I'll take you to dinner at Ciro's." "And you, Mr. Latimer," said the Count, "may I conduct you to the presence of my high-born master? He wishes to show his gratitude to his preserver." "You may," said George. "May I have my hat, Mr. Sturgis?" There's one bit more. After dinner that night I came up for a smoke, and, strolling on to the foredeck, almost bumped into George and Stella. They seemed to be having an argument. "I'm not sure," she was saying, "that I believe that a man can be so happy that he wants to kiss the nearest thing in sight, as you put it." "Don't you?" said George. "Well, as it happens, I'm feeling just that way now." I coughed, and he turned around. "Hello, Reggie," he said. "Hello, George," I said. "Lovely night." "Beautiful," said Stella. "The moon," I said. "Ripping," said George. "Lovely," said Stella. "And look at the reflection of the stars on the—" George caught my eye. "Pop off," he said. I popped.